When you live by yourself in the bush, with only a couple of dogs and your horse for company, I dare say you get a bit touched. I only know that you come to look upon your animals as friends. You not only talk to them, but you get to know them so well that you can tell when they're afraid, upset, or suspicious. That's why I never doubted that this thing I'm telling you about actually happened. Because both my dogs and my horse knew and felt that something was up that night. I ridden old Sandy up to a bit of a rocky hill at the back of Wyamoul, where I was looking after the sheep and fences and living in the hut on my own. Ruff and Bluey, my dogs, were with me, and they took a great interest as I set about digging out a small rabbit warren on the hill. Sandy, with the reins hanging over his head, cropped lazily at the spear grass and dozed. Rabbits go pretty deep in sand, and it was getting on for dusk when I followed the last pocket along. The shovel rang faintly on something solid. I thought it must have been a stray stone that the rabbits had carried down, till I saw its shape. It was an old Aborigines axe head. I threw it away and went on digging. The shovel rang again. And this time I saw a round white thing like an upturned basin. I scraped the sand away and dug out a human skull. It was an Aborigines, as I could see by its shape. More digging unearthed the rest of the skeleton, or most of it anyway. I guessed it was the owner of the old stone axe head, and I thought for a few moments on those primitive hunters and how the bush knew them no more. I reburied the skeleton as best I could and was about to put the skull back with it when I got one of those challenging quirks of notions you get sometimes. I decided that if I took it home and stuck it on the mantelpiece of the hut, I might have some fun with the boss or others who might visit me. There was a star or two low in the east when, mounted on old Sandy with the skull under one arm, I set off for the hut. I was jogging along when I felt the tremor go through the nag. I spoke to him and tightened the reins, but he shuffled along without further sign. Then Ruff, he was always ready for a fight, growled and went stiff-legged towards a patch of scrub. Bluey crept in close to Sandy's heels and ambled along there with his tail down. I was just starting to puzzle this out when the horse snorted, half turned towards a patch of hot bush where Ruff was nosing about, and he stopped dead with upflung head. I felt his muscles tauten under me. What the devil, I thought. Perhaps there was a dingo about. I felt a bit disgusted to think that Bluey should be frightened of a dingo. Then Ruff came back and looked at me as though to say he'd made a bloomer, and headed off towards the hut. Sandy's body slackened. He dropped his head and shuffled away, and Bluey ran ahead after Ruff. Whatever had startled him had evidently cleared out. I had turned Sandy loose into the little night paddock and was now having me tea. I felt a bit funny there, sitting there with a skull on the mantelpiece. But I wasn't afraid of dead bones. I remember I drank the Abo's health in black tea. The hut door looked out across a level stretch of plain. It was my habit to lean against the door and watch the night come across that silent land. There was a moon, and it gave the scene a breathless beauty as its light grew. Silent and still lay the plain. The sense of peace always made me wonder how men could go and live in crowded towns when you couldn't know the slow, long sense of immensity that comes with moonlight on the plains. Suddenly Ruff growled, and Bluey came cringing to my feet. I heard Sandy snort and gallop along the fence. I stepped round to watch the horse, and as I did so, a cry rang out. I paused. My heart hammered. My throat went dry. I heard Bluey whine and Ruff give a high-pitched bark. I'd heard nighthawks on the Murray that sound like a woman being murdered, and the terrible sobbing of a wounded hare and the far cry of a mating dingo. But this was none of them. I'd never heard anything like it. Well, I don't mind admitting that I went back to the door as quickly as I could, and from there I searched the plain with my eyes. But there was no living thing in all that moon-drenched silence. I knelt down, peered in every direction, and looked along the level of the plain. Not a thing stirred. Bluey's cold nose touched my hand, and I jumped. just holding back a yell. This steadied me. "Old man," I muttered, "you've been out here on your own too long. You've seen things." Yes, but that was just the trouble. I couldn't see anything. And then, why was Sandy and the dog so restless? It took me a long time to settle down. And finally I did, and after another draw at the pipe, went to bunk. Bluey always slept on the doorstep, and Ralph at one end of the veranda. I heard them scuffling as I blew out the light. Usually I drop off in 5 minutes, but there was to be no sleep for me that night. I called myself all sorts of a nervous fool. Tried all the old going-to-sleep tricks. It was no good. And then I heard a steady, fast thumping. I realized it was my own heart, and this made me sit up in the bunk. And as I did, I heard Bluey whine and Ruff give another of those nervous barks. Then I swear I was wide awake. I distinctly heard a sound of someone going past outside the hut with bare feet. A cold wave of alarms went from my head to my heels. And then came the reaction. I jumped out, grabbed my old Winchester off the wall and pumped a pop cartridge into the breech. And I crept to the window. I thought of escaped convicts, homicidal lunatics, drunks in the horrors, robbers. There was nothing. Nobody. Plainly silent under the moon. I gazed from the window a few minutes, then turned towards the dark and still living room, and I cried out in horror. Skull outlined in white light grinned back at me from the mantelpiece. I knew the light came from a chink in the roof and let the moon in, and I knew those eyeless eyes watched me as a shadow without a head came and stood within the door. I can't tell you how long I stood there in voiceless horror. My hands refused to lift the gun. A chill ran through me like the breath from the grave. My starting eyes tried to see clear. The silence as though time was stopped all around. Still the skull stared from its black sockets, and still its shadow stood. And somehow I slammed the door and ran to the window. I called and whistled to the dogs. I thought of scrambling out of the other window and catching Sandy and riding to the head station. But I wasn't game to leave that room. I was now in such a state that I could hear all sorts of things. And I even believed somebody was trying to open the door. I'm not sure what happened after that for a while. Maybe I went out to it. I don't know. The next thing I do know is that I was standing outside the hut with a skull in my hands. And as I stood there, I saw a vision of black warriors gathered round a primitive grave and placing spears and boomerangs and an axe with the dead, so that when he reached the hunting grounds, he would be well equipped. These things were as a vision, but I knew that the headless shadow standing beside me was something more than a vision, though I was not afraid anymore. When I reached the grave, I uncovered the skeleton and gently replaced the skull. Then I filled in the hole with my bare hands and smoothed it off and stood up. I looked for the shadow and saw his arms move as though in salute. The moonlight was soft, and there was a delightful coolness as I went slowly home. And I found the dogs curled up contentedly on the veranda. I slipped into bunk. Down from the starry hunting grounds came the ringing bugles as wild swans winged through the ancient corridors of the sky.